Thank you, everyone, for inviting me. I think for all the people that have been involved with COPE over the years, I'm actually quite excited to get the chance to speak to you all on COPE's birthday. And I didn't actually realise until today, but COPE and I share a birthday. So who knew? Although, you know, with so many rational and mathematicians in the room, it's not actually that unlikely statistically that two people might share a birthday. So I'm going to talk about research data in the context of some of the challenges and opportunities for publication ethics in the next kind of 10 minutes or so. And I do talk a lot, so I'll try to move it along. So what this isn't is an advocacy talk. Because I'm guessing you're not really interested in zealotry around open access and open data. However, I bet you are very interested in evidence. And these are some of the things I often say about open access to data and why it's important. And I've taken the opportunity to evidence all of these statements about some of the benefits, which are good for researchers, and they're good for journals, and they're good for publishers. Firstly, more citations and use of research. There's a growing number of studies that show that papers with data available are more highly cited. Another study that's shown that that reproducibility could be improved with access to data, because lack of access to data can be a reason why research can't be reproduced when perhaps it could or should be. Researchers can be more productive. I guess that basic principle of being more organised and being able to reuse their own work more easily comes into play there. Also, there's a very important evidence of lack of access to the full results of research from drug trials around reboxetine, for example, can actually lead to real harm in patients. Another interesting perspectives emerging on actually how it can help researchers progress their own career if they work transparently and reproducibility, and increasingly to the high standards that funding bodies and journals are now expecting. So I'm also very interested in what researchers say, or at least what they say when they respond to surveys. Again, I have laboriously evidenced all of these statements, and sorry you can't see the references. There are some from PLOS and some from some publicly available market research done at Springer Nature. But more than half of researchers do actually share their data, often in not the most effective ways. Email is actually still the most common way of sharing data, rather than via public repositories, for example, which is generally preferred. But researchers wish to share data for good reasons, for altruistic reasons, to progress the research in their field, but also for selfish reasons, which is fine. They want more increased use and reuse of their work. They want to comply with their funder policy, which I think is very important, because as publishers on things like open access and also open data, we have an interest and a role in enabling compliance. However, there are a number of things which stand in the way, a number of problems which, in a similar group of surveys, researchers report may be preventing them from sharing as much of their research data as they perhaps could. Some of these are technical issues or legal issues, perhaps not understanding issues around copyright and research data. As a publisher, I find copyright very exciting, but researchers perhaps are more concerned with doing research than copyright. Some of these are technical and skills issues. They may not know about metadata, curation standards, or how to make data available in a way that others can really reuse it. And some of these issues are simply around time and money, or awareness of where and how to deposit research data in a public place. But the last one I think is also important, about uncertainty about meeting the cost. But I think that is changing as more funding agencies sort of acknowledge the costs associated with research data management and provide for it. So what are publishers doing about it? Quite a lot. I'm not going to talk about all these. I'm really just going to talk about the last one. But we have new types of journal. We have new types of article that are designed to make data more available. Publishers are engaging with the idea of citing research data so researchers can get more credit. We're trying to encourage research to be reused by making it more openly available. More than 10 years ago, publishers, the STM Association, put out a statement saying we will not take copyright in research data. There are some interesting experiments around peer review of data, although to be honest, a lot of journals don't really do it. Also, better use and partnerships with data repositories to make data more findable. And awareness raising. I guess one thing that journals, for everything that is criticised of journals and publishers, we are still quite good at getting stuff read. So raising awareness of the issues around data reproducibility is really important. And the final two pieces really is around guidance, information for authors, which we all have an awful lot of, and we know everyone reads it word for word before they submit. But also on policy and data policy, because there's a lot happening here across the board, but I also give you some Springer Nature perspective, so caveat. I'm employed by them. Okay, so data policies. So there is quite a landscape of data policies. Perhaps you might not be able to read this so well, but what I really intend to show is that there are a number of different approaches from different journals, different publishers to data policy, in particular on how strongly they might encourage or require researchers to share their data. And there can be very good reasons for why one approach is taken over another. For example, a number of Springer journals are now engaging with data sharing, encouraging data sharing. We have much more common approach where journals from, whether it's Biomed Central or the Royal Society or Nature journals from last year, they're requiring a new section in every paper, a data availability statement. So this is something which is becoming more common and I think is a really important tool to help promote data sharing. And then even more involved or aggressive approaches, mandating data sharing, having a statement in every paper, having a link to data sets in every paper. And actually there was a nice study by Tim Vines that showed that when a journal takes that approach of mandating, putting stuff in a repository, including a link, you are actually much more likely to get access to the data 5 or 10 years later. And then we've got journals, GigaScience, F1000 Research, Scientific Data, which you can't even submit a paper unless your data is available. So there's lots of different approaches. And there's also lots of different policies and lots of journals that don't have policies at all still, and actually an awful lot of funders that have no policy on data, but around 45 or so now that do. But one of the challenges is, for researchers and publishers, is that these policies are often still very different in their requirements. So helping researchers to understand whether they're subject to a policy and then helping them and the journal to comply with it is a challenge. So one approach of trying to tackle this problem is a project at Springer Nature, which we started last year, and we're trying to standardize research data policy across 2,500 journals. So we have about 1,000 journals now that have adopted one of 4 different types of policy. I'll not go into the details, but as one moves from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, there are a growing number of requirements and checks in place on the availability of research data. And it was necessary to take that pragmatic approach in order to make sure that every journal could actually be engaged with the concept of data sharing rather than attempting to put very strong requirements on some journals initially. So that's a work in progress. There's a preprint that talks about it in more detail. And this is my penultimate slide, actually. So I don't have answers to all these questions, but I just wanted to think about some of the issues that have come across the desks of some of the editors that I work with and some of the issues that research data sharing might arise for those that handle papers. So I think a feature of research data policy that we see quite often is that as a minimum step, researchers might be able to say, my data are available on reasonable request. What is a reasonable request? And that's something that is useful. Vagueness can be useful sometimes, but also it means that there's a need to look at sometimes at a study-specific level as to what is reasonable and what is not. For example, if I go to CERN and generate petabytes of data, it would be unreasonable for me to be able to send that to you tomorrow. So there's a lot of need for study and discipline-specific consideration here. But there is an important role for the journal. If you take some journals that have this kind of data policy where researchers have to share on reasonable request, there is a role of the journal if that request is not complied with, that they should be able to get involved, notify the institution. I'm certainly aware of those kinds of cases. Another issue is, what are we actually talking about when we say research data? It depends on your discipline. It might be better to say actually files or non-traditional research outputs or stuff. But so really, what data are we talking about when we mean the data supporting a paper? And again, that's something that can change almost on a study-by-study basis. Another area is around compliance with policy. So we already see corrections published if a journal has or a paper does not comply with an open access policy. And I think we'll start to see similar issues around data policy. Something else that we talk about is versioning and updates. So with many more places online, repositories where researchers can put data and put links in their manuscripts, those objects aren't always static, depending on where it's been put. And so having good systems for versioning and actually being clear that the things that are described or linked to in journal articles are the things that peer reviewers saw, or at least had the opportunity to see, is really important. We also talk about authorship. So data repositories, data papers are a good way to enable people that maybe didn't write the traditional manuscript but were involved in data generation to get some form of credit. But we also see challenging areas where researchers might actually request co-authorship if one were to reuse their data, which personally I don't think is a good approach. Data peer review, I say it's a challenging area, it's a time-consuming area, and I don't think that many journals are really doing it in full. And there can be good reasons for why that is. But where data are peer-reviewed, and lots of journals still operate anonymous peer review, enabling reviewers to access data in a repository in a way that preserves their anonymity is actually not the most simple thing to do technically. So we've come across those issues also. And it's similar to journal publishing in general, but data publishing presents even more challenges and opportunities around sensitive data, personal data, considering the role of the editor and reviewers on checking that sensitive or personal information is not published is another important issue. And I'm also aware of at least one case, and I imagine there will be more, where we have a data journal that published a data paper that described a data set that was published some time after the original paper. And the peer review process for the data set actually led to a correction to the original article. On balance, this should be a good thing, but we all know that it may not be viewed as such initially by some of the people concerned. And the final point and final slide is that we need to acknowledge the costs of doing this as well. So open data are awesome, but they're not free. And one of the practical conversations we have to have with our editors is how much extra time it might take if you change your policy. So I'm sharing some data with you, which I can actually unblind. These were a group of the Nature journals. And we introduced data availability statements last year. And I had the editors self-report for each paper they handled over a 2-month period, how many minutes it took them to get this extra information, this statement into the paper. And what we can see is you've got neuroscience on the left, physics, and then cell biology, and then on the right-hand side, geoscience. But the point is that it was a lot faster on Nature Physics. And when we analysed actually the contents of those statements, many more of those statements said data were available on reasonable request. So when there's less information, less links to check, it's maybe self-evident, but it's good to have some evidence. That might take longer. But the other important point is we're actually comfortable with this amount of extra effort. And this very simple statistic has actually been a very useful thing to then take that conversation to other journal editors when they really want to understand what is it going to take to implement this kind of policy, and for us actually as a publisher to figure out how we can reduce that burden on editors by enhancing editorial office functions as well. And that was all I wanted to say.